Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to our presentation on the association between suboptimal sleep duration and cardiovascular disease prevalence among Asian American subgroups. My name is Isabel, and I'm joined by my colleagues Santosh and Risa.
So 2 months ago, in June of 2022, the American Heart Association added healthy sleep to its list of essential elements of heart health. Optimal sleep is important for good heart health because it allows your body and mind to recharge and is essential for ensuring your metabolic pathways are properly regulated. Due to the addition of sleep as a CVD risk factor being fairly recent and limited research beforehand due to some skepticism of whether sleep is directly associated with cardiovascular disease, very limited research has been conducted on this association, with research into the association among Asian Americans in particular being even more limited. So our objective with the study is to evaluate the association between cardiovascular disease prevalence and suboptimal sleep among Asian Americans and compare the relation specifically among the three largest Asian American subgroups, Asian Indians, Chinese Americans, and Filipino Americans, and compare those to non-Hispanic whites.
For our research, we used data from 2012-2018 person sample dot files from the National Health Interview Survey, or NHIS. NHIS is a cross-sectional interview household study that is conducted through face-to-face interviews, and the purpose is to monitor the health of the US populations by gathering health info. We chose to specifically focus on Asian Indians, Chinese, Filipinos, and other Asians, as other disaggregated Asian American groups were not provided on NHIS. We also chose the years 2012 to 2018, as certain risk factors crucial for cardiovascular disease were not included in prior years. We first wanted to identify Asian Americans and non-Hispanic whites with cardiovascular disease, or CVD. We identified these persons as individuals who were told they had coronary artery disease, heart attack, angina, also known as chest pain, or stroke. We chose to only focus on individuals older than 40 years old, and counts for our weighted samples are provided on the screen. We then wanted to look at sleep duration and covariates associated with cardiovascular disease. And based on the AHA's recommendations, we categorize optimal sleep as being between 7 to 9 hours and suboptimal sleep as either less than 7 hours of sleep or greater than 9 hours of sleep. Afterwards, we proceeded with our statistical analysis. For our project, we decided to exclude individuals with no identifiable race, as well as any missing data regarding any of our predictor variables. We initially wanted our covariates to focus to touch on the AHA's essential 8, but then we also expanded our covariates to address additional social determinants of health. Our covariates can be broken down into 4 large categories: socioeconomic status, also known as SES, health conditions, demographics, and behaviors. However, despite considering these covariates for our analysis, we chose to only focus on the association between sleep and CVD due to the low N counts by covariates. We conducted univariate analysis to understand the proportion of those with suboptimal sleep and CVD by race. And afterwards, we proceeded with our regression analysis. We looked at the odds ratios in order to understand the association between suboptimal sleep and cardiovascular disease across subgroups. And for no association between these variables, we would expect an odds ratios of 1. We also calculated the 95% confidence intervals to measure the range of estimates for our odds ratios.
For our results, we first graphed the prevalence of CVD outcomes, which are heart disease and stroke by race. So on this bar chart, on the x-axis, we have the race, and on the y-axis, we have the percentages. The red portion of the bar graph is to indicate those with heart disease, and the blue portions indicate those with stroke in each race. And we want to highlight that the prevalence of these diseases is different across groups, which supports prior literature that we found that stroke prevalence is different amongst racial groups. And for example, Asian Indians only have 13% of those with stroke, whereas other Asians have twice as much at 26%. We also created a similar bar graph to showcase the prevalence of different sleep durations, so optimal versus suboptimal in each race. You'll notice that in this graph, there are 2 separate parts. So the left box is focusing on the population with heart disease, and the right box is those with stroke. And once again, we want to highlight that the prevalence is different amongst groups. And for example, we see that there is more of those with suboptimal sleep in other Asian American groups compared to the Asian Indians, who have low prevalence of those with suboptimal.
So by conducting the previously mentioned linear regression and univariate analysis, we were able to generate the odds ratios for suboptimal sleep by Asian American subgroup as seen in this forest plot. There is a tiny and statistically insignificant difference in the risk associated between sleep duration and CVD when comparing Asian Americans to non-Hispanic whites. And similarly, although there is a tiny difference in the risk associated between suboptimal sleep and CVD among the Asian American subgroups of interest, these differences are also statistically insignificant. Put another way, regardless of your race and ethnicity, if your sleep duration is suboptimal, you have an approximately 75% higher chance of developing CVD compared to someone whose sleep duration is optimal. The limited variation in the association between suboptimal sleep and CVD prevalence among Asian Americans and when compared to non-Hispanic whites indicate that although suboptimal sleep is indeed a risk factor for developing CVD, and proportions of populations that have suboptimal sleep vary, with, for example, Filipino Americans having a substantially higher proportion of people that have suboptimal sleep compared to Asian Indians, the association between suboptimal sleep and CVD is not affected by one's race or ethnicity.
As for the limitations of our research, there are particular biases we want to address, such as sampling bias due to the fact that NHIS is only conducted in English and Spanish. So that limits the ability of those that can only speak native Asian languages from participating. Recall bias occurs when answering questions such as the hours of sleep, as that is self-reported, so the report might not be accurate. A social desirability bias that occurs when answering questions related to health behavior such as smoking status. People might not be honest about it. And then finally, small sample size of Asian American groups. So this limited the ability for us to disaggregate other Asian groups besides Chinese, Filipinos, and Asian Indians. For next steps, we aim to aggregate Asian Americans together to increase our sample size, since there's no major difference in the risks associated with suboptimal sleep by race and ethnic subgroups. And we also want to conduct multivariate regression and account for additional CVD risk factors such as hypertension and cholesterol.
Before we conclude our presentation, we'd like to acknowledge Dr. Yang, Dr. Yarno, Dr. Srinivasan, Armon, and Dr. Vora for their support and mentorship throughout the summer, as well as the CURE faculty, fellows, and scholars for being there with us every step of the way. Thank you so much, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Terrific presentation, team.